Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's edition of Women and Money Montreal. My name is Lynn Sock. For those of you who are attending for the first time, or if you're coming from meetup.com, I invite you to please join our Facebook group, which is under the same name, Women and Money Montreal. There's a lot more interaction in that group, and you can stay up to date with all the events that are coming up, as well as some of the summaries and tips and tricks that I post during the week. Again, whether you are attending for the first time or watching the replay afterwards, Women in Money Montreal began back in 2020 as a way for me to teach financial literacy on a regular basis. Tonight is actually our 122nd Tuesday webinar. So congratulations and thank you to everybody who keeps coming out and supporting the cause. So those who I haven't had the opportunity to meet yet, to give you a little bit of my background, I'm an independent financial security advisor, Quebec licensed, and I've been in the industry since 2003. And when I began Women in Money Montreal, the purpose was to provide a safe, non-judgmental environment for women to learn more about personal finance, investing, real estate, and entrepreneurship. There's no sales pitch. Everything's explained in everyday language. And we meet every Tuesday, 7 p.m. and we discuss different topics. So tonight we are going to talk about something that has been top of mind for a lot of people, and I feel that it's not explained well enough in the news, as well as there's a lot of false information on social media. Today we're going to talk about what the heck is going on with the Canadian dollar. If you're attending for the first time, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I will get to the questions as they come. Sometimes I have a tendency to speak fast and I don't realize it, so please feel free to jump in and ask your questions. Stop me at any time. Chances are, as I always say, if you have a question, someone else probably has the same question, but they might be too shy to ask. And tonight we're going to be talking about the Canadian dollar and currency. There's going to be quite a bit of technical jargon, so I'll try my best to explain everything. So in order to explain what is going on with the Canadian dollar, we need to go through some basics first. So I wanted to start off with just some general currency basics. What is currency? What makes it go up and down? So I'll start right from the beginning. So currency is basically what we use to make purchases within a particular country. So here in Canada, our currency is the Canadian dollar. In the US, it's the US dollar. For most of Europe, it's euros, so on and so forth. And I don't want to say not in a perfect world, because I don't think we need to be in a perfect world to have this, but I guess in a logical world. Hi, Nancy. It's been a while. In a logical world, currency would be the same in every country. So the holidays are coming up. I know there are a lot of people who are traveling. So in a logical world, wherever it is that we're traveling, we should be able to take our Canadian dollar to the country that we're visiting, and our dollar is at par with their currency. But that's not what happens. As those of us who travel, anytime we travel outside of the four walls of our country, we need to exchange our currency to whatever currency it is they're using in the country that they're visiting. For many, many reasons, currency is not the same everywhere, and the value of the currency in a particular country will fluctuate over time. So, and we'll get into that when we compare the Canadian and US dollar. The value of a currency is determined. There are many factors that come into play. It's determined by supply and demand of that particular currency. Other factors include interest rates. It includes a country's inflation. It includes the flow of capital within that country, how money is circulating, the money supply. Is it a country that's AAA grade cash rich? How's the economy doing? How's the inflation, the unemployment rate? Even silly things, and we'll end with this later on, silly things like political statements, tweets, posts on social media. These are factors that can affect a country's currency and whether the value of the currency goes up or down. When we talk about currency and the value, actually, no, before we get into that, when we talk about the value of something, forget currency for a second. When we talk about the value of something, it's always in relation to something else. Here's an example that's not related to money at all. The expression, it's expensive. I see a lot online right now, people complaining that things are expensive. Restaurants are expensive, clothes are expensive, vacations are expensive. But when you talk about the value that something's expensive, it's always in relation to something. And a concrete example that I have is, actually, I'm borrowing this from my daughter. Those who follow me personally, my younger daughter is selling her jacket, and she asked me to post the jacket online. So she's worn it for one season, and she's selling the jacket like new, worn one season, for $300. To some who read this, they'll say, wow, that's expensive. But I'll give you a little bit more detail. It's actually a Rudsak jacket. So the Rudsak jacket, I think the original value was $700, and she's selling it for $300. Now, some people are still going to call it expensive. Other people will call it a deal. And it's in relation to what you're selling and probably your preconceived notions of what expensive is. So when you talk about the value of something, it's always in relationship to something else. When we're talking about the Canadian dollar, 9.99999 times out of 10, we're talking about the Canadian dollar in relation to the US dollar. When our dollar will go up and down depending on what's going on in both of our economies. And the reason why we compare it to the US dollar is because we're so intertwined with their economy. There's so much trade that goes back and forth, contrary to what some people are saying, especially right now online. We both need each other. So our dollar is always in relationship to the US dollar. And you know what? Vice versa. Who dictates or who controls the value of currency? It's all those factors that I explained before, but it also starts with the central bank. So prior to COVID, and I've said this many times in my webinars that have to do with mortgage rates and interest rates. So prior to COVID, nobody really knew what a central bank was unless you were in finance or unless you were an economist. So every developed country has a central bank, and it's basically a branch of the country's government that dictates the flow of money within its borders. It is the government department that monitors a country's inflation. They also dictate what the prime lending rate or the overnight lending rate is. In our country, in Canada, our central bank is called the Bank of Canada. And actually tomorrow there is a rate announcement. In the US, their central bank is called the Federal Reserve. In England, it's called the Bank of England, so on and so forth. So each developed country has their own version of the central bank that controls the flow of money going in and out. Now, it's not a hard stop that they control the value of a currency, but what they want to do is try to stabilize it, which is why the central bank will determine using a lot of economic factors if interest rates will go up and down. And knowing this and understanding this will help you understand what's going on with our Canadian dollar, because this is something that is not talked about enough in the news, or it's not explained very well in the news. Central banks, a country's central bank, is key to the value of the currency, but it's not the only determining factor on how the valuation of a currency compared to another country. Another thing I would like to add is that a currency's value is always in relationship to another country. It's just because our dollar is dipping compared to the US, it doesn't mean it's worth more compared to another country. It's just that like I said, we intertwine a lot with the US. We travel a lot to the US. We do a lot of business with the US. So when we talk about our dollar dipping, it's in relation to the US dollar. Again, for those who are jumping on, if you have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat. So Now to answer the question, which is why we're all here, what the heck is happening with the Canadian dollar? So if you've been watching the news, if you've been looking online, you've been hearing that the Canadian dollar has been dipping, it's dipped to new lows. There have been some very scary headlines, but what exactly is happening? So as of today, I believe, basically 1 Canadian dollar is worth about 71 cents US. I believe that's what the last amount was. It basically means that if we are traveling or if we are exchanging our money, our dollar doesn't go very far. So very simple example, I go to New York a lot. I like to eat. And here in Canada, if I go to a restaurant in Montreal, I'm running errands and I'm buying something from Baton Rouge or whatever, I know that I'm spending at least $20. I'm spending $20 here in Montreal. Tax and tip not included for just a simple meal, no matter where I go. Now, if you travel to the US, you go to New York, which is where I go pretty frequently, same idea, going to an average everyday restaurant, it's still going to cost me $20, except it's costing me $20 US. So $20 US is, when you convert it, it's about $28 Canadian. So same meal, same style restaurant, same how many stars. I'm paying more for that meal in the US than here, because that same meal over here would be worth $20 Canadian versus $28 Canadian when you do the conversion. So our dollar doesn't go very far when we're in relation to the US. I don't know if anybody here is traveling to down south for the holidays, but typically when we travel down south for the holidays, like to Mexico, anywhere but Cuba, so Mexico, the Dominican, if we're traveling down south, we usually go to the currency exchange to exchange our Canadian dollars to US dollars so that we could tip the people. Oh, Mel, don't cry. Don't cry. So we usually go to the currency exchange with our Canadian dollars and exchange it to US dollars so that we could tip the staff while we're at an all-inclusive. That's what I usually do anyway. So something that's very typical for me, if I'm going to an all-inclusive, I'll go to the currency exchange with $200 cash and ask them to exchange it. If I did this today, not including any service fees because we're trying to keep it simple, if I did this today, my 200 Canadian dollars would give me about $140 US. Now, here's something that we haven't really done in a while. If you're traveling to a country that accepts pesos, it's actually better for you for the first time in a while to convert your Canadian dollars into pesos, because your Canadian dollar will stretch further in pesos versus the US. So that's one way to look at it. The value of our dollar is going down in relation to the US. So for anyone who's traveling down to one of the Latin countries, if they accept pesos, exchange into pesos. A very simple example, I always relate everything back to food. I love my steak. So if I was traveling to Mexico, as an example, and I have my pesos with me in my pocket, and I go to a restaurant off resort, a filet mignon is probably going to cost me somewhere around the ballpark of 800 pesos. And with that $200 Canadian that I just exchanged, I could actually go back and buy like 3 or 4 steaks while I'm there. If I go to New York, that same $200 Canadian, if I convert it to the US, if I go to New York or anywhere in the US, I might be able to buy 1 meal, 1 steak, maybe 2 if I get a good deal, because my Canadian dollar is not stretching far when I convert it to the US. So that's just a little tip if you are traveling, if you're traveling down south and you're used to converting your money into US dollars, it might be a good idea to look into converting into pesos versus US dollars, or whichever country you're traveling to see what the exchange rate is going to be. For those who don't know, our dollar has actually been declining for a couple of years. It started around mid 2021 and it's been declining, and then it kind of stabilized, and it's been declining again since September of this year, and that's what's making big headlines. So what exactly is going on? A couple of different things. One of the things that's going on is that, remember I was talking about the central banks earlier? So central banks in every developed country will control what the overnight lending rate is. So Canada has actually been dropping our overnight lending rates well before the US. And so now there's a bit of a spread between the two. And what does this have to do with the Canadian dollar? It means that more money is staying inside US financial institutions. And why is that? That overnight lending rate, when everybody says, oh my God, they have a rate announcement, not only does it affect variable rate mortgages, which is what people are most paying attention about, when they make those rate announcements, it also affects GIC rates and high interest savings rates. So these are called deposit accounts. And when interest rates, when the central bank's rates are up, GIC rates, high interest savings rates are also up. When rates start going back down, GIC rates and high interest savings rates are less attractive because their rates go down. So because in the US, they have been slower to lower their rates, more and more people are keeping money inside banks in the form of GICs and in the form of high interest savings accounts, which means there's just more money that's sitting in there. So this is one of the reasons why our dollar is starting to lose value in comparison to the US. It's because, it's simple math. Here in Canada, if you want to open up a GIC, you're looking at a rate of about 3.5%, versus in the US, it's about 4.5%. It's simple math. If you go to two different people and one's offering you 3.5% and 4.5% of interest that they're going to pay you, you're going to go with the higher interest rate. When the central bank's interest rate is higher, it's just more worthwhile for people to leave their money there. It's more attractive. Prior to 2022, the end of 2022, I did almost no GICs or high interest savings accounts. Like, I didn't have a single client who had a GIC or high interest savings account, because most of my clients, I teach them how to actually invest their money. But when 2022 hit and interest rates were going up, I had no choice, because I would lose clients. So it's what's the expression? If you can't beat them, you join them. So interest rates were, GICs and high interest savings account rates were much higher then in 2022. They were much more attractive. People wanted to put their money in them. So here in Canada, because interest rates have gone down, they're less and less attractive. But in the US, they're still attractive. So there's more money sitting in cash in the US, which helps their dollar, but it lessens our dollar. So that's one of the reasons why we have such a spread between the two. Another reason is because the interest rates are higher in the US, the economy is still booming, even though interest rates are higher in the US. Canada we have a stable, safe economy. We don't take too much risk. I know this because I have a tech company, and Canada overall is not very open arms when it comes to the tech sector. They don't like to take risks. Lenders, banks, investors don't like to take risks. Whereas in the US, south of the border, they're more about, let's be innovative, let's be the best, let's be the fastest, let's go all in, let's dive into the deep end. They're capitalists as a country. They want to go. They want to dive into the deep end. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. It's just, in a situation like we are right now, the US economy is booming, even though interest rates are still high. See, here in Canada, the same thing wouldn't happen over here. Much more stable, much more safe. We're not that sexy. We slow and steady is how Canada's economy is versus the US. So this is kind of what's going on. There are also other reasons, but I'll get into that in a bit. Like I mentioned, tomorrow is our rate announcement, And for the US, their rate announcement is next week Wednesday. I think it's on the 17th, Tuesday or Wednesday. I can't remember. Our inflation rates are lower than the US. These are all factors that come into play when it comes to the dollar. Again, if there are any questions, please put them in the chat. I don't see anything other than Mel crying and Nancy, nice to see you. All right, so I went over kind of like the terminology, but now what does this mean for you? So who wins and who loses when it comes to a low Canadian dollar? So let's start off with who wins and who benefits. Who wins and who benefits? Exporters to the US. So if you own a company that exports to the US, or if you work for a company that exports to the US, you win. You're more attractive to US companies who import from us. Who wins or who benefits? Those who sell in US dollars. So if you have an Etsy shop, if you have an Amazon store on amazon.com versus .ca, if you sell coaching services in the US, you win because you are more attractive now. Those who get paid in the US. So if your 2 feet are here in Canada, you are Canadian as Canadian could be, but you get paid from your company in the US, or you are self-employed, run a business and get paid in US dollars, you win. The other people who win when the Canadian dollar is low are local industries. So sometimes because the dollar is low and the US dollar is higher, certain products that you would normally get from the US, they're more expensive. So local industries who offer the same product or service will benefit when the Canadian dollar is low, because Canadians who are here, their 2 feet are here, are looking for Canadian alternatives that will be less expensive for them versus purchasing in the US. So those are the 4 main winners when our Canadian dollar is low. Exporters to the US, those who sell in US dollars, those who get paid in US dollars, and our local industries. If you're comparing them to the US, people will tend to go with more local choices because it's less expensive than buying from the US. Those who lose, those who don't benefit, are basically the opposite. So those who import from the US to Canada. So if you own a company that imports from the US, if you work for a company that imports from the US, this is not a great time for you. If you are Canadians purchasing in US dollars, so if you're purchasing stuff for your business, or if you're just going to the US, I gave the example earlier of buying a meal in the US. I go to New York all the time. And something that I've noticed over the past couple of years, what cost me $20 Canadian is now also $20 US when I go to a restaurant. Well, $20 US, it with the conversion comes to about $28 Canadian. It's not worth it for me to go to New York on vacation to just grab a couple of meals, because it's costing me more for the exact same thing that I could get up here in Canada. Now, if I need to go to the US for business, that's a whole different story. But as for pleasure, really, dollar for dollar, I'd much rather stay here. I'm just going to check the comments to see if there's anything. No. So basically, anybody who receives some type of payments from the US, you're winning. If you are paying anyone in the US, not so much. It's not the greatest time right now. But this is just temporary, guys. If you look at the history of the Canadian and the US economy, there are ups and downs. Just like with the stock market, there are going to be ups and downs. Right now, we're in a period where the Canadian dollar is low and the US dollar is nice and strong, but it's not always like that. If we go back, if we go back about 10 years ago, so I think it was 2011 to 2014, our dollars were actually pretty much at par for about 3 years, give or take. We were both floating around the dollar mark, and it was at par. And the reason why is because we were exporting a lot to the US at the time. So, both Canadians and Americans were fine, because it was almost like there was no exchange with currency. Whether we as Canadians went to the US or Canadians came up here, it was the same dollar. So there were different moments in time, and depending what's going on in the world, depending on what's going on when it comes to trade between us countries, this could affect the value of our currency. One point that I wanted to get across tonight is that it's not all doomsday just because our dollar is going low. And this is a misconception that's out there. A misconception that's out there is that it's all gloom and doom. We're heading into a recession. It means that it's bad. It's just downhill from here. Not necessarily. For the majority of us, a low dollar is not going to affect us. How is it going to affect us? In the examples that I gave before, depending on the industry that you work in, depending if you're traveling. But for the majority of us, for certain things, let's say there's a certain product that you like that you could only get from the US, it's going to be an inconvenience for now. But at another point in time, when the Canadian dollar is doing really well, then it's not going to be an inconvenience for you, and you're going to be on the winning side. So just remember, this is a temporary moment in time, because that's how economies work. They go up and down, especially Canada and the US. So even though it's very much doomsday right now, and there are a lot of rumors that we're headed into a recession, I even caught on Instagram a sponsored ad from a mortgage broker out in Toronto who went on a 90-second rant about how we're already in a recession and we've been in a recession, and put all your money into real estate. Just be careful about these posts on Instagram, TikTok, and even news media. They're awful at explaining how things work. Excuse me. They're awful at explaining how things work. Take everything with a grain of salt. Like I said, for the majority of us, a low Canadian dollar isn't really going to affect us. If anything, it'll just be an inconvenience because of certain products and services that we use that come from the US. If you are exporting your services to the US, if you're getting paid in US dollars, this is a great time for you. I have quite a few clients who are coaches or offer services like graphic design, web design, and they're paid in US dollars. This is a great time. This is a great time and period for you. It's not all doom and gloom, as they say. I'm just checking to see if we are missing anything else. Nope. So that's who wins and loses. And lastly, the last point that I wanted to make is, so what's next? And the Trump effect. So just today on Truth Social, Donald Trump posted a message to Justin Trudeau, and he basically called him the governor of Canada, the 51st state of the US. Now, I'm not going to get into the history behind it. They met last week, and there's a little they're basically jabbing each other. So I've seen on social media and in the news, they've taken this comment and ran with it. Now, Donald Trump will do what Donald Trump does, and I'm not here to comment on how things will go when he does enter office, but Donald Trump will just do what he does because he likes the attention. We have to remember that. We have to take him with a grain of salt. The reason why people are freaking out right now, and probably the reason why some of you might be here, is because you may have heard that Donald Trump mentioned that on day one of his presidency, the first thing that he's going to do is impose tariffs on the import of Canadian and Mexican goods. So a tariff is basically a tax on, in this case, on imports. So for any company in the US who's importing goods from either Canada or Mexico, what Donald Trump is suggesting is that he's going to impose a 25% tax of whatever goods are imported into Canada and the US. Now, even though he's saying this, even though it's making major headlines on BNN, Bloomberg, Yahoo Finance, and all economic news, there are a lot of steps that need to be done before that actually comes into play. And like I mentioned several times during this webinar, we Canada's economy and the US economy are so intertwined. We need each other. There was a comment that I read online that said Canada literally produces nothing. I beg to differ. We produce a lot, and not only do we produce a lot, we export a lot of goods to the US to the tune of, I'm just going to get the stats, over $200 billion of goods is imported. Sorry. We receive over $200 billion of goods from the US a year, and Canada actually exports over $300 billion of goods to the US every year. So we for sure need each other. There are things that we have that the US doesn't have, and vice versa. Our biggest export is crude petroleum, which yes, they do have in the US, but the quality and the caliber isn't the same as up here. I could go on and on. Transportation is one of our biggest exports. So not only certain vehicles, but also vehicle parts. So I know people who are in the car export business. For a while now, business wasn't good because car manufacturers, the car business in the US didn't need those imports from Canada. But now, because of the low Canadian dollar, business is back in action. With the low Canadian dollar, US dealerships and US companies are importing trucks and other vehicles from Canada to the US. So business is picking up. When it comes to the Canadian dollar and currency and value, it all depends what end of the stick you're at. And like I said, for the majority of us, it doesn't affect us. But for certain businesses who export to the US or who import from the US, that's who it affects. Now, the whole talk about tariffs, look, Donald Trump will say what he says. There's a lot of steps that need to be taken before that's actually implemented, and it really doesn't benefit anybody. It doesn't benefit the US. It doesn't benefit Canada. One thing I will say is this time around, this presidency, Trump is a little bit better in picking his cabinet. I'm not saying it's all good, but it's a little bit better. He's actually putting some people in place who have some experience and who are more neutral. Again, not saying that it's across the board, but there's a lot of steps that need to be done. And one of them is, if you remember, during his first presidency, he actually replaced the original NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement that blocked any tariffs between Canada, US, and Mexico. He replaced that with the United States Mexico Canada Agreement. And in order for him to implement those tariffs, he needs to do so in a way to not violate the agreements, the very agreements that he replaced with the original NAFTA agreement that's been around forever. So, grain of salt. For the majority of us, it's not going to affect us. For the majority of us, it might be an inconvenience because of certain products or services that we could only get in the US, but that's it. When it comes to your investments, which is the other question, again, grain of salt. Yes, Mel brought up Hydro-Quebec. Exactly. We export hydro, makes a bulk of the revenue from northeastern US. So hydro is a big exporter of electricity. When it comes to your investments, a question I've been asked is, so is it a good time to invest in Canada now? Is it a good time to invest in the US? What about the currency exchange? Again, when it comes to investments, we're going through a weird time right now. I feel that we've been saying that for a few years. If you're already invested, you need to take a look at your current investments and see if there's any room for opportunities, either on your own if you're self-directed or with your advisor. Don't necessarily jump the gun and say, well, you know what, it's better for me to invest in Canada because the economy is weaker, so the markets aren't doing as well. That's not necessarily true. You have to take a look at your whole portfolio, where your money is, how long you've been invested, and what's the best strategy moving forward. If you are not invested at all and you're like, I'm a clean slate, I don't know where to start, it's hard for me to say where to start. Even though if you go online and probably ask in one of those groups, everybody will give you their opinion. It really, really depends. when it comes to investing anyway, it's supposed to be for medium to long term. So even though we're going through a period right now, it doesn't matter. The point is get in, make sure you invest, make sure you stay invested, because when it comes to the stock markets overall, they all tend to go up in the long term. So it's more important to make sure that you're invested at all versus just keeping money in a checking account, not doing anything. Let's see if there are any other comments or questions. And yeah, so I don't see any comments or questions, but I just wanted to say that I know there's a lot of panic. I know that there are a lot of news headlines that say that we're heading into a recession and times are going bad or whatnot, but we're actually doing really well. We're actually doing really well in spite of being in a global pandemic, despite high interest rates of 2022 and 2023. Both economies are actually doing really well, despite the Canadian dollar is low. Like I said, for the majority of us, it really isn't going to affect us. It's just something that's a little bit sensationalized online. Take everything you read with a grain of salt. And like I always say, when it comes to money and headlines, be a little selfish and ask yourself, how does this affect me? Even if we were headed into a recession, ask yourself, how does this affect me? Am I going to lose my job? In a recession, for a lot of us, it doesn't affect us, especially if you're in an industry that's in high demand. It doesn't affect you. So when it comes to a low Canadian dollar, you need to ask yourself, well, how does this affect me? I know for me, it doesn't really affect me. I don't accept payments in US dollars. I don't, I don't import or export from the US, so it doesn't affect me both either good or bad. The only thing it really touches when it comes to my life is traveling to the US. I don't feel like doing it right now because there's no reason for me to, unless it's for business. Then in that case, it doesn't matter. But on the day-to-day, it really doesn't affect me. So if you're worried about what's going on in the economy, if you're worried about the dollar being so low, a low dollar is not the end of the world. It depends what end of the stick you're at. And like I said, for the majority of us, it really doesn't affect us. If you have any questions or comments, and you want to discuss it afterwards, I'd be more than happy to hop on a call with you. Maybe you're too shy to ask, or maybe you're watching the replay afterwards. But take everything with a grain of salt. Donald Trump likes to, he's just loud. So half the stuff that he says, he doesn't even understand what he's saying, or he's just saying it to get attention. I'm not saying this because I'm anti-Trump. I'm neither for or against Trump. I'll put that out there. That's the type of person that he is. He's just the loudest person in the room, and sometimes he'll just say things. So take it with a grain of salt. Just figure out if this is going to affect you or touch you and your lives and your family's lives. For most of us, it's not. So just carry on and do your thing. Work hard, save, live below your means, invest money, take care of your family, have some fun, and that's it. So next week is our final webinar of 2024, and we're going to be talking about, is now the right time to go variable? Depending, I sort of have my presentation for next week, but it might change depending on what happens tomorrow at our rate announcement. But it's a question that's been popping up a lot. A lot of people's mortgages are up for renewal, or a lot of people are planning to buy early next year. Is now the right time to buy variable, or should we wait? So join us next week. You're going to receive a copy of this recording as soon as we're done, and then a follow-up email with the link to join her next week, which will be our final one. And the last thing that I want to mention is we have, for anyone who wants to attend this Thursday, we have a 5 à 7 networking dinner at Madison's Laval. If you're interested in attending, please reach out. We have a reservation for 10, 12 people. So if you want to join us, let me know. Come by, buy whatever you want to eat, and it will be nice to meet some of you in person. So take care, everyone. Have a great night, and feel free to reach out if you have any other questions.